Hello, hello, and welcome to our monthly webinar. We're so excited to be here today to talk about a really important topic in women's health, which is looking at blood sugar regulation and the importance of looking at fasting done well, done right. And we're trying a little bit of a different model this month. We're going to have a conversation, and we have the amazing Dr. Chante with us from the Wisdom Medicine team to be able to lead us through this conversation, really to understand why this is such an important topic in women's health, why it is something that we need to really be able to have some time to set aside and do a deep dive on. And so we have some of you who are here with us live on the webinar today, which is wonderful. And we want to encourage you to please put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll get to the questions from everyone towards the end of the talk today. We want to make sure to have that time to get your questions answered because there's a lot that comes up. And when we talk about this topic, it's got a lot of different angles to it. So we want to make sure that everybody's questions are heard here. So welcome everyone who's joining. Welcome, welcome. And Dr. Chante, do you want to take a moment just to introduce yourself and we'll get started with questions from there.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Chante Tonia. As Frankie said, I'm one of the clinicians on staff with Wisdom, and I am going to be talking to you today about the benefits of intermittent fasting as it relates to blood sugar. And I hope that you find this information informative and that you can possibly learn more about intermittent fasting and implement it into your daily lifestyle.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I realized I didn't introduce myself. So for those of you who are new to me, my name is Frankie Shelton. I am the co-founder of Wisdom Medicine. I'm a clinical nutritionist by training. I've actually was a nutritionist for a little over a decade before co-founding Wisdom Medicine. And so we're so excited to be able to, especially as a background in nutrition, we can probably talk about this conversation for days and days and days. But we'll try to keep this conversation to around 20-25 minutes today. And if we need to do a part two, we will.
Sounds good.
All right. So just to kick us off so that we're all on the same page, Dr. Chante, I would love it if you could give us just some kind of bird's eye view overview of how do you define glucose and insulin, and how do those two work together in terms of how the physiology is kind of co-regulating those two in the body?
Yeah, so glucose is the breakdown product of the carbohydrates that we eat. So, for example, if we eat, let's say, a piece of fruit, apple, right? It's considered to be a healthy fruit, a healthy food for us to eat. But of course, because it has some carbs, it's going to increase our blood sugar. And so, when our blood sugar increases, our pancreas will then release a hormone called insulin, and insulin will then partner with glucose, bringing it up to our cells and helping it to get into the cell where it can get utilized for energy. So, our goal is to be in good metabolic health, meaning that insulin glucose balance is in balance and that we're not having too much glucose in the blood where we don't want it to be, because that can cause other health issues and problems that we don't want to have, especially with being a woman.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about that piece. Like, so obviously we're not throwing men under the bus here, but we do know that because insulin is a hormone, that it has some different ways that it interacts with the woman's physiology. And so we want to make sure that we kind of leave the call day today, giving people a lot of insight on the why and the what behind blood sugar regulation, intermittent fasting. But why is this topic so important specifically in women's health?
Well, it's important in women's health because we know that our insulin is really the foundation for our hormonal health. And so when our insulin is high, when we're producing too much insulin because we have too much carbs and not really eating the best diet for us, and our blood sugar is spiking all throughout the day, it increases our insulin. making our pancreas have to work much harder to pump more insulin because it's trying to find a place of homeostasis. It's trying to keep our insulin and blood sugar levels balanced. And when that doesn't happen, when we become more insulin resistant, what happens is it has a direct impact on our hormonal health, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and even our thyroid health. And not that this doesn't have an impact on men, but because as women we're cyclical, right? We have a 28-day on average menstrual cycle, and so when our insulin is in check, then our hormones are in check, and it allows for us to have a healthier menstrual cycle. And we know that our menstrual cycle health is really a reflection of our overall health. So when our hormones are out of whack, our whole body is out of whack.
Mm-hmm. So well said. And I think that one of the things that many women, come to us for all stages of hormonal health, starting in puberty all the way through a lifetime of menstrual cycle issues, into fertility issues, infertility issues, and all the way into perimenopause and menopause. And I think that one of the things that is really important is that we can have to understand is that we can have a change in how our body regulates insulin or regulates glucose throughout our lifetime, right? So sometimes we can think back and we're like, oh, I used to eat like this in my 20s and there was no problems. And then when we start to see changes in our blood work, gradual changes in our fasting glucose, that can be a sign that things are changing in our metabolism, things are changing in the way that we're processing that glucose. So it's not like we get this one set way that we deal with glucose in the body and then that's how we are the rest of our life. We really want to be informed about it so that we understand how it's changing and how it's affecting our symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and lifestyle change is so important, especially as we age. I always tell our members and the clients that I work with that a lot of the things, the lifestyle that we live, the way we ate, the way we treated our body, too much alcohol, the things that we did in our 20s, once you hit 40, if you don't make changes, it definitely has a negative impact on your metabolic health and your hormonal health.
Mm-hmm. And one of the key hormones that we see decline in perimenopause and into menopause is our estrogen levels oftentimes. And estrogen is really key for us to keep the glucose in good regulation. And so a lot of times that's where we start to see those kind of signs of metabolic changes creeping up, like you said, and like even as early as 35 into our early 40s, we start to see those changes take hold. And it can kind of be one of the first things that's like, oh, I'm starting to feel fatigued. My energy is changing. I'm starting to hold on weight in areas that I didn't used to hold on to weight. The sleep piece, right? Like all of these signs of changes of how our body is metabolizing, regulating glucose really can come out in so many different myriad of symptoms for women as we age. So really important to think about and to have this conversation that we're having today about how do we maintain insulin sensitivity, right? Like kind of a flexibility in how we're using our insulin.
So one of the things that we can do is definitely eat good quality fats, right? So the foods that we're eating. So for instance, with good quality fats, that allows our cellular membranes to be more porous and less rigid so that that insulin can do its job of bringing the glucose into the cell. So how do we do that? By eating good quality fats such as olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, ghee, butter, avocado, and also nut butters, and just reducing our intake of these industrial seed oils that are extremely inflammatory and going to make that cell membrane more rigid. So things like canola oil and soybean oil and safflower oil, sunflower oil. So I always encourage the women that I'm working with to read your food labels, right? We go over how to read a food label so that you're more educated and empowered to make those healthier food choices. Other things that we can do are eliminating toxins, right? So we're exposed to toxins on a daily basis. We try to do the best that we can with what we're eating and, not putting toxic chemicals on our skin, cosmetics and things like that, but definitely eliminating the toxins, what I like to call obesogens. So obesogens are chemicals that make us gain weight. And where do we find them? In plastic bottles, the water bottles that we drink. We also find them in a lot of the cosmetics that we wear, fragrances, scented candles, laundry detergent. So making sure that we eliminate those toxins as much as possible. And also getting rid of the toxicity in our thoughts. Oftentimes we talk about detoxifying our physical, but we don't detoxify our mental. We can have a very negative connotation about aging and like what that looks like with respect to our hormonal health and just our overall health in general, and not really being good at managing our stress, especially as women. We have partners, we have children, we have careers, and we just often don't take the time to nurture ourselves, and that spikes cortisol levels. And when cortisol levels spike, we know that impacts insulin, and insulin impacts our hormones. So definitely working on detoxifying and then also nourishing the mitochondria. So I have 3 ways in which we do that. The mitochondria is so important. It's the cellular energy that our cells are able to get their processes done. And so by nourishing the mitochondria, we support insulin sensitivity and allowing again that glucose to get into the cell. And so we can do that by fasting, because fasting makes ketones, and we know that ketones nourish the mitochondria. Also, for the vegans and the vegetarians, or for those who are not vegan and vegetarian, they might be open to eating more organ meats, which have a lot of nutrients like B vitamins, CoQ10, vitamin E, omega-3 fatty acids, and zinc. And so that also helps to nourish the mitochondria. And getting sunlight. Getting about 15 minutes of sunlight per day actually helps to increase vitamin D, which is good for mitochondrial health. And also, it increases ATP and our cellular respiration so that our cells have more energy. So, those are definitely some ways that we can work on allowing our bodies to be more insulin sensitive.
And I love those options that you threw out there, because I think that sometimes when we think about insulin and we think about glucose, it's like, oh, that's something that only diabetics need to deal with,
Mhm.
or only pre-diabetics need to deal with. And I think when you lay it out the way that you just did, you realize that insulin is a crucial factor that is influencing and working together with so many different systems in the body. It is not on its own island, and it is not
Yeah,
on an island that only needs to be visited if we're diabetic or pre-diabetic. This is a system and a way that we're working with insulin that needs to be dealt with by everybody, especially women, for all of these reasons. And I think that when we think about the traditional medical system and how it's being monitored in the traditional medical system, oftentimes we're really only getting our fasting glucose measured. We're only getting that one snapshot, maybe once a year if we go to an annual doctor's visit, where we see that fasting glucose if we happen to be fasting when we go get our blood work done, right? So there's a lot of things that have to line up
absolutely.
even to just get a fasting glucose
Mhm.
checked. But that is really the only key or the only sign that we have, just to see, like, is there a change happening? So many people go years without recognizing that they're having a change in their fasting glucose, or having any understanding that they actually are dealing with glucose issues at all, or insulin dysregulation. And that's the thing that I think is so important. Is like, you can't, like, unless you know your own signs and symptoms, you don't know always that you're pre-diabetic or that you're
Yeah.
having insulin issues or glucose issues, until you find out, hey, that fasting glucose is rising. So I would love to hear from you, Dr. Chante. What are other tests that we need to be asking for? What are other ways that we need to be thinking about monitoring glucose levels, just to make sure that we're not missing anything?
Yeah. Well, fasting glucose is really a good place to start. It does give us some information, but there are other markers that really help to tell the story about our metabolic health. So when we're looking at fasting uh, blood glucose, I often like to see optimal ranges between 70 and 90. Um, Also, the other markers we have are hemoglobin A1C. So hemoglobin A1C is our the measurement of our blood glucose over 3 months, right? So that gives us a lot of information as to how our blood sugar is going from month to month. And then we have one of the markers, fasting insulin. It's not something that most people usually see on their standard labs, especially when they're getting their annual physical. But I like to look at fasting insulin because it gives me information, again, about what's going on with the metabolic health. And as that insulin begins to increase over time, that's a sign that something is going on. Usually the reference range goes up to about 25, and optimal ranges are around 10. With insulin, I like to see ranges 7 and below, because that shows me that the person is more insulin sensitive. Even with the hemoglobin A1C, usually we like to see levels below 5.7%. And that's standard, but to me, that's still an indication that there's some insulin resistance because believe it or not, levels greater than 5 indicate that there's some insulin resistance going on. So I like to see levels 5 or less to make sure that the
Mhm.
person has really good metabolic health. And then there's another marker that you really don't see often, and you may have to request your medical doctor to order it for you or one of our wisdom practitioners, but it's called HOMA-IR. And HOMA-IR is the homeostatic model assessment of insulin. And what it looks at is your fasting insulin in relationship to the fasting glucose. And so it actually gives us more insight on your degree of insulin resistance. So levels less than 1, you would be insulin sensitive. So that's optimal. Greater than 1.9 is early insulin resistance, and greater than 2.9 means that's significant insulin resistance. So those are the 4 markers that I would definitely look at, but you can still get a lot of information just with fasting glucose, insulin, and a hemoglobin A1C.
It's wonderful. And as we can see, it's complex, right? There's so much
Mhm.
more that needs to be looked at to be able to get this full picture of how glucose and insulin are operating together, right? They're a team, they're keeping one,
Yeah.
we need this like teamwork between them to be able to keep that glucose level in balance. So when we think about other options, we are really excited at Wisdom this month because we are actually just rolling out a blood sugar bundle, which is another way of looking at blood sugar. And we're looking at it through the lens of continuous glucose monitoring. So, for the first time ever, Wisdom is releasing a way of getting started. So, if you're interested and curious about your blood sugar regulation, how it may be affecting your symptoms, how it may be being affected by your lifestyle and dietary choices, this is your chance to be able to get started and get your foot in the door. So the way it's going to work is that with the blood sugar bundle, you'll be able to get access to a continuous glucose monitor and a doctor's visit with one of our Wisdom women's health specialists to be able to really understand what are the first steps that you need to do to be able to work your way into that good metabolic health range that we're looking for. If you've never used a continuous glucose monitor, it is real-time feedback for you to be able to understand over the course of 12 to 14 days exactly how your glucose levels change after every meal, after you sleep, after you exercise, all of those factors that play a role, how stressed you are, all of those roles all those things that play a role in your glucose regulation you get to see in real time. So it can be a huge insight into what is going on with your body, how your body is in terms of this insulin sensitivity. Anything you want to add on the continue? I know that we're all so
Yeah, I
excited at the
love the
Wisdom team.
Yeah, I love the continue. I'm actually wearing mine right now, but I
I
love
love
the
it.
continuous glucose monitor as well as the Keto Mojo. So those are the 2 tools that I usually recommend to my women that are doing fasting, just because my goal is to always ensure that the people that I'm working with that are fasting are doing it safely and effectively. And if your blood sugar is dropping too low while you're fasting, I want you to know what those values are so that you can stop. So the Keto Mojo actually allows you to check both your glucose and your ketones. So we know when we break down carbohydrates, or we get glucose, and then when we break down fat, we get ketones. So it's a good way. It's a finger stick. It allows you to check your ketones and your glucose. And of course, like Frankie said, the continuous glucose monitor allows you to continuously throughout the day see how your blood sugar is doing. And I love the fact that it really helps you to identify the foods that could potentially be spiking your blood sugar throughout the day that you may not even be aware of. So it gives a lot of great information.
And I love that how the personal touch that it adds. So with this bundle, you'll be able to get the continuous monitoring like in real time on your mobile device to be able to see exactly what's happening. But then to be able to get the personalized follow-up visit, to be able to look at what's happened over the course of that time, to be able to give you that advice and the next steps to get started. One of the
Mhm.
things we've heard over and over again from people is I love what Wisdom is doing, but I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to sign up for the whole program. And we really wanted to create something where we could reach more women, get more information into more women's hands to be able to get started right away, because we couldn't think of something more direct and more impactful than the continuous glucose monitor. And so many of our doctors are already using it with their members in Wisdom already, but we feel like it's something that really deserves to be in the realm of women's health as a tool and not just relegated to people with diabetes and prediabetes. This is such an important thing for women to understand, that cascade of effects that come from good glucose regulation. And you can tell, like, in each person is going to experience, say, something like eating white rice differently, right? Like everybody is
Absolutely.
going to have a unique reaction to foods and how they affect their glucose. And so it's a fascinating insight to have that it's extremely personalized.
Yeah, I love that.
Yes, and so I want to jump into the intermittent fasting piece, and I would love to hear a little bit from you, Dr. Chante, about your journey with falling in love with intermittent fasting, because I know that this is something that you've been up to in your own personal life and have been working with our members on quite a bit. So can you share a little bit about how you found your way here?
Yes, intermittent fasting is so near and dear to my heart. So at the beginning of this year, between January and February, I had my routine appointment with my gynecologist. And it was at that visit that I was told fibroids that were once pretty small had grown a little bit larger in a short period of time. And so after talking to her, and we just kind of talked about my lifestyle and my diet and different things, and I realized that my diet had become, especially around the holidays when I love to bake and cook, my diet had become a little bit too carb heavy. And I was about 10 pounds heavier than my ideal weight. And so I literally made a decision to revamp my diet, and I took all grains out of my diet. I took refined sugar out of my diet, dairy, coffee, and alcohol. And I've been doing that pretty much since January, February of this year. And then I also implemented intermittent fasting. And within 6 weeks, the weight just fell off. I couldn't believe how quickly I lost the weight with those changes. And then I wanted to go deeper into intermittent fasting because now that I'm in love with it, I want everyone to be in love with it. And in doing my research, I came across a book called Fast Like a Girl by Dr. Mindy Peltz. And it just helped me to fall even more in love with fasting because I learned how to do it not only for my metabolic health, but for my hormonal health. So, for instance, there's times during the month where we should be eating more. There's times where we should be fasting more. Our hormones are ever changing. And so there's pretty much nothing we should be doing the same all month long, maybe unless sleeping or drinking water, but it should be changing with our cycle. So there's times where we should be fasting more and times where we should be fasting less. For instance, the week before your period is not the week to fast, right? That's our progesterone building phase. So we need to slow down and rest and nourish and nurture ourselves with good, healthy carbs and not man-made carbs, and making sure that we have the glucose that our body needs in order to make progesterone and the other minerals such as magnesium with a little bit of dark chocolate. And so I went deeper after learning all of this information about fasting and seeing how it really impacted my health for the better. I actually took a course and became a certified fasting coach in addition to being a naturopathic doctor. So my goal is to teach the women that I work with as well as our members how to fast for their unique metabolic health and how to fast in a way that's safe. Because oftentimes we hear a lot of the negatives about fasting, and it could just be that you're not fasting the right way, right? Maybe you're doing it the same all month. And maybe men can do that, or postmenopausal women who have less fluctuations in their hormones throughout the month, but not us as menstruating women. We need to do things a little bit differently.
I love that. I think that it's such an interesting, I think you're right in that there's definitely like different things that people have heard about fasting, like how intense it is, or like there can be some fear around it. And I think to just know that the way that one person needs to fast is not going to be the same as every other person, and that there is this monthly cadence that we have to take into consideration to be able to best nourish our body. I think that one of the things that's always surprised me about fasting is a lot of the studies that have been done only on men,
Absolutely.
or the majority of them have been done on men. And when we think about this unique tailoring that we do at Wisdom to women's bodies
Yeah.
for hormonal health, it's such a beautiful way to be able to tap into really working in that partnership with a doctor to know exactly how fasting could work for you and the different levels and gradients of
Yeah.
fasting. I mean, even just what is called circadian fasting can be so beneficial, which is just looking at a 12-12 fast, looking at, how long, how many hours are there between the last meal of the day and when we
Mhm.
sleep. There's so many different nuances to it. So I love that you have gone and fallen so far in love with it and gotten the certification to be able to help so many of our members to be able to do this well, to have the right support, to have the right partnership to walk through the process.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
And the one thing I love about fasting is that, or two things I should say, fasting is free. So you don't have to pay. It's not a supplement you have to buy. It's available to you, the person who is extremely busy or the person who has time to do it. You can make it fit your lifestyle. So and it's not time consuming, so you can adjust it. Like if your children have after school activities and you're getting home late and you have to eat a later dinner, okay, you don't have to be glued to a time to eat or time to fast. Just fast a little later the next day. So I love the flexibility that fasting allows, especially for the busy working woman.
Hmm. I do. Yeah, it's such a great point. And I think that one of the things that so many of our team members, doctors, nutritionists at Wisdom are also in love with the microbiome. And I think that that's where I am been always so fascinated in the crossover between fasting and the microbiome, like how we can use fasting as this way of resetting the microbiome, giving this kind of ability to have a clean slate or a fresh slate, being able to change the way that we're processing carbohydrates, which goes back
Yeah.
to our conversation earlier in this call about how we're looking at glucose. What do you feel about the things that you see most often in terms of the outcomes of fasting when it comes to the microbiome?
Fasting definitely has a positive impact on the gut microbiome. And there's actually the 24-hour water fast is the fast that really is good for any type of bacterial dysbiosis or SIBO or anything that falls along the lines of having inflammation in your gut. It's because 24 hours is enough time for that release of stem cells to be released. And once those stem cells are released, they actually go in and repair and heal the mucosal lining. And so fasting is definitely beneficial for having good gut health. It increases our good bacterial flora and decreases the bad bacterial flora. Fasting also changes your taste buds. So the one comment that I often get from women after they've implemented fasting for a little while is that they're not as hungry throughout the day. And their cravings are less. The high carb, sugary processed foods that they once craved, they're no longer craving. And I believe that that's because, number one, their taste buds have changed. And also, these individuals are more intentional. They have more awareness. When you're fasting brings you more awareness of how many times am I really eating throughout the day? Oh, I was eating this many meals throughout the day, or you know it just allows you to be a little bit more intentional about what you're eating and how
Mhm.
often you're eating.
So important. Well, I know, like I said at the beginning of the call, I know that Dr. Chante and I could talk all day about this topic. But we want to make sure that we get to your questions. So there we have a few questions that have come into the Q&A. So I will read those out and feel free to continue to drop more in the Q&A if you have them. So first question, is it possible to have normal fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C, but still have issues with blood sugar throughout the day? I've always had normal numbers, but feel like I'm hitting a wall in the afternoon after lunch and just feel fatigued and can't seem to focus as well as she would like. Is this the time to try something like a CGM?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend a CGM for that scenario, just because maybe there's something that you're eating that's spiking your blood sugar throughout the day and you may not know. For instance, and it allows you to see what you're eating and how your body is responding to that. I can tell you that the oat milk that you're putting in your coffee may be spiking your blood sugar, but until you see it, then you're really able to make that correlation. And also, with respect to that question, I would also say what is considered normal as far as labs, because sometimes labs are interpreted as being normal, but from a functional medicine perspective, they're not normal. So I would definitely, look at those optimal ranges to make sure that, you're in those ranges and that you are actually having good metabolic health according to your blood work.
So good, so good. And I think that one of the things, just to go back to the CGM piece of this, I think it's a perfect, like, especially if you've identified a specific time of day where you feel a certain way or you're having a certain set of symptoms. I find that to be such a good reason to jump on something like the blood sugar bundle with the CGM, because what that is going to allow you to do is play with different combinations of food. So if we think about, we've talked a lot about glucose and carbohydrates, but there's also, like Dr. Chante said, fats, there's fibers, there's proteins, right? So looking at how you're combining your lunch meal, you have 12 to 14 days to practice. Like, okay, I do this combination for lunch, and this is what happens to my blood sugar. I do this combination, and this is what happens. And you really get to move those levers for yourself to understand how much of each of those macronutrients you need to be able to be in the right combination. And I think so especially if you've like identified already, like put the magnifying glass on, this is the type of day the time of day that I want to pay attention to. This is the meal I want to pay attention to, can be so, so enlightening. So great question. Great question. Um, second question. Oh, I love this question. I've heard that women aren't eating enough and that can mess up their hormones. Could a CGM show me if I'm eating too little?
Well, definitely, if you're not eating enough, it will definitely reflect in your blood sugar. So a CGM could definitely be helpful with that. Also, I would ask, to really answer that question, I would have to know what you're eating throughout the day. Are you feeling full? Are you feeling satiated? How many times are you eating? What are you eating? But the CGM definitely can be helpful with that.
Yep, and this is a great point for the blood sugar bundle. We will be doing some tracking of the diet so that you have that feedback to take into the doctor's visit, so that we can kind of line up what happened in the meals during the day to be able to correlate it with the blood sugar level. So it's a great way to be able to pull it all together. I think too, this is such a good point though, that we do focus a lot on hyperglycemia or like high blood sugar, but it is true that many women experience hypoglycemia, and especially when you're thinking about hormonal conditions like adrenal fatigue, thyroid issues, um, even reproductive hormone imbalances. Hypoglycemia can have a huge effect on the rest of the hormonal cascade as well, and can cause the body to feel like it is in an emergency situation, in a very stressful situation, if it's not done, if we're not using fasting appropriately and we're just maybe skipping meals, moving through the day without enough caloric intake. So that's a really great point. And the CGM will show you both your highs and your lows to be able to correlate that. Um, third question, does what you mentioned for fasting as menstruating women apply to women in menopause as well?
Yes, it does. And there's what I like to use what's called a 30-day reset. So for the woman who is postmenopausal, we can use the moon cycles to guide us as to when you should be fasting. You can actually fast a little bit more like a man when you're postmenopausal, just because the hormone fluctuations are less. So there's some fasting regimens that I like to is like called the 511, which is like 5 days of intermittent fasting, 1 day of a prolonged fast, which could be maybe a 17-hour fast or up to a 24-hour fast, and then 1 day of no fasting. Because even though the postmenopausal women doesn't have the fluctuations and the spikes of hormones like a woman that is still cycling, we still want to honor progesterone. And progesterone does not like stress, and fasting is a form of stress. So we incorporate 1 day of no fasting for the postmenopausal woman.
Wonderful. And I think that this speaks to the final question is how do I know what type of fasting is best for me? And I think that that's where working with a provider, understanding where you are in your hormonal timeline, understanding what your hormonal history has been can play a huge role in this, how your adrenal function is, how much kind of fortitude you have to be able to explore the fasting journey and when the best time and when you're going to be able to get the best use out of that. Anything else you would add to that, Dr.
Yeah, I would
Chante?
say even before you start fasting, I always encourage the women that I work with to clean up what we call your sugar burner system. And the reason why we do that with cleaning up your diet is because having a healthier diet that's nutrient dense makes fasting so much easier. When you already have poor metabolic health and we don't start off by getting those toxins out of our body, managing our stress, eating good quality foods, it just makes you get stuck in the gap. So the gap is where your body is trying to come from that sugar burner over into the fat burner where you're burning ketones, and you will get stuck there if you're not eating well and your lifestyle is not conducive to fasting. So I usually say start off by cleaning up your diet and then you start slow. So for the woman that's cycling, maybe after two months of cleaning up your sugar burner system, you can then implement fasting on a smaller scale. So I would say from about day 1 to day 10 of your menstrual cycle, maybe do about 13 to 15 hours of fasting. Then from days 11 to 15, that will be like your ovulatory window. You can fast more so toward the 13-hour. We don't want you fasting too much there, especially if you're trying to conceive. And then from days 16 to 19, you can hone in on fasting again and help your body get rid of that estrogen that had just peaked right before ovulation. And then the week before your period, no fasting. Just nourish yourself, rest, love on yourself. Instead of doing high intensity exercise, maybe do some yoga or walking. And, if you can make your schedule a little lighter during this time, it will help you while you're on your period because then you will be less symptomatic.
Wonderful, wonderful. Such a good answer. And I want to wrap with this final question that I see over here in the chat. Just in terms of the best way, is a CGM a good way to break a 24-hour fast? So if you have been fasting, would a CGM or kind of looking at how your glucose is functioning after doing fasting, would that be something that you recommend, or how do you work with CGMs and the fasting
Yeah,
together?
I would love for every woman that I'm working with to have a CGM. I mean, at minimum, the Keto Mojo, but the CGM is even better because you're just really getting a information on what your blood sugar looks like throughout the entire fast. And what I like about the CGM is, like, for instance, if your glucose levels drop below 50, you want to stop fasting. And sometimes you won't know that with just a fingerprint because it's just a snapshot. But when you get that little beep on your phone from your CGM that your blood sugar is too low, okay, I can stop fasting. So I would
Mhm.
definitely recommend the CGM for intermittent fasting, but especially for prolonged fasting.
Mm-hmm. That's a great. Because I think that that is where, like, the more monitoring that we can do and the more we can understand what's happening during fasting. Because I agree with you. I have historically always used the Keto Mojo during different
Mhm.
fasting trials that I've done, fasting programs I've led, and I feel like it's just that insight, right? Like,
Yeah.
because it's uncomfortable. Like you're
Hmm.
getting used to something new. Like it's not always like the first day isn't always the easiest, right? Like there's a lot
Yeah.
going on. And so just being able to have the monitoring as like a backbone to what you're going through in fasting can
Yeah.
be so helpful because you can be like, okay, this is where I'm crossing that line, or this is where my numbers are going, to be able to feel like you're supported and you understand what's happening on a deeper level, which is great.
Yeah.
Um, I think I've got all the questions. There's one more question here. I'm not sure exactly what it was referring to. What are some other options other than organ meats? I know that you mentioned organ meats in the
We were
beginning.
talking about nourishing the mitochondria. So you don't have to eat organ meats. That was just one option. But fasting, because fasting releases ketones when you're burning fat. So that's also a way to nourish the mitochondria and getting sunlight. I know here on the East Coast, it's very dark in the mornings now. Like it's still dark around 7 a.m. So it's harder to get that morning sunlight. So I usually recommend the members and women that I work with to get a red light therapy lamp. It really is beneficial for getting that red light that you would normally get from the sun. I use mine every single morning, sometimes before bed. It helps not only to nourish the mitochondria, but it also helps with our circadian rhythm and our energy levels throughout the day and having good sleep hygiene. So that's definitely something that you can look into doing as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chante, for this amazing conversation. I know everybody here has dropped great questions. If anybody has any follow-up questions about starting to work with Dr. Chante, because now you are also in love with the idea of fasting and knowing how to do it right, or if you have any questions for us about the new blood sugar bundle with the CGM monitor and the doctor's visit, please do reach out to our team. You can reach us anytime at the clinic if you want to get more information about how to get started and to understand what program might be best for you. We look forward to hearing from you, look forward to continuing to support you as always. And please, please take good care of yourselves out there. And we will see you next month for our next webinar. And let us know what you want to learn about. What do you want to hear about? What would you like to have conversations about? What are some of the burning questions that you have in terms of a webinar that you would like to see on the docket coming up? And we look forward to seeing you then. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.